Wanted to welcome everybody. My name is Cliff Swiggett. I'll be the debate chair for the evening. And tonight we're having a Braver Angels style debate on climate change. And I really want to thank you all for being here. I wanted to start by thanking a few other folks. First of all, Braver Angels, who runs events like this across the country and are dedicated to bridging the partisan divide in America. And our co-hosts, the University Gathering United Methodist Church, Carbon Washington, and the Washington Policy Center. We really appreciate your support. And finally, I wanted to thank this incredible team of volunteers from across Washington State who've been working behind the scenes to organize and staff tonight's debate. I'm going to do a quick shout out to Joe Pratt, Raul Talasillo, Mike and Sue Wallace, Terry Stilson, Janice Dickinson, Yvonne Boyd, Judy LeBlanc. Thank you all so much for your help putting this together. It couldn't have happened without you. And then looking at the chat window, I've seen people from North Carolina, Alabama, Montana, lots of Washingtonians and Oregonians, and that's super exciting to see you all here tonight with us. A little heads up that we're going to have to close the chat window in a minute, and Harry will be using that chat window to send out helpful information as we get into the debate. Tonight's resolution is free market forces will never be enough to address climate change. The government needs to play a strong role. And this is a Braver Angels style debate. It's not about winning and losing. It's not about vanquishing your foes. Everyone attending tonight has the opportunity to make a speech, ask questions, offer a rebuttal, or simply listen. And our goal is to deepen understanding, to discover common ground, and create relationships that help bridge divisions and turn down the polarization and vitriol. We consider this style of debate a collective search for truth. Tonight's debate will start with a slate of lead speakers who are citizens, activists, scientists, economists, policy experts, and more from the Northwest and beyond. And I want to thank all of our lead speakers for being here and having the courage to kick things off. They'll present a wide range of perspectives. There'll also be plenty of time for others to speak, and we want as many of you to participate as possible. So please consider making a speech or asking questions or offering a rebuttal as the debate unfolds, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. We've got a few simple rules that ensure we maintain civility and avoid personal attacks. The number one rule of a Braver Angels debate is that you say what you believe. You don't have to have a prepared speech. Some of the best speeches are spontaneous and come from the heart. You may be inspired to respond to what someone else has said, and if you are, go for it. You don't need to be an expert. This issue of climate change affects us all, and our personal experiences, our hopes, our beliefs, they're all valid, they're all relevant. It's also okay to have some fun. Doesn't have to be all serious. And along these lines, we have a Braver Angels debate tradition that we call jazz hands, which you can use at any time during the debate to show appreciation for your fellow debaters. So let's just try out our jazz hands. They work like this. Great. See, somebody can do one jazz hand while drinking tea with their other. That's great. So if you hear something you really appreciate during the debate, use your jazz hands, and that's a little bit of team spirit for everybody getting in here and being courageous. Tonight's speeches will alternate between those that are leaning affirmative and those that are leaning negative. And for our resolution, affirmative means you tend to believe that stronger government policy is required to address climate change. Negative means you tend to believe that the government should step out of the way and let the free market address this issue. If your thoughts don't fit neatly into affirmative or negative, that's fine. Speeches that are more nuanced or may not be strictly aligned with the resolution are absolutely welcome. You can speak from your head, you can speak from your heart, and you're encouraged to respond to what earlier speakers have said. We'll start with 4-minute speeches, then we'll go to 3 and 2, and we want to hear from as many people as possible. If speeches do go over the time limit, I'll need to ask speakers to wrap up to keep things moving. If you want to make a speech at any point during the debate, use the Zoom chat feature to let your whip know, and they'll be glad to put you on the list. So let me introduce our debate whips for tonight. They are Sue Wallace, Janice Dickinson, and Terry Stilson. And they should all appear at the top of your participants window. If your first name begins with the letters A through D, your whip is Sue Wallace. If your first name begins with the letters E through L, your whip is Janice Dickinson. M through Z is Terry Stilson. And you can see that Terry's just dropped that information into the window. So once again, if at any time you'd like to make a speech, get in touch with your whip and let them know. Or if you have any questions about the debate format and the process, get in touch with your whip. They're here to help in any way that they can. After each speech, we'll take a couple of either questions or rebuttals. And questions should seek understanding, elaboration, or clarification from the prior speaker. All questions are limited to 1 minute, and ideally they're much shorter. When you ask a question, sometimes it's tempting to make a mini speech, and I really want to encourage people to keep their questions short and to the point. And if you want to make a speech, get in touch with your whip and let them know. Rebuttals are different than questions. Rebuttals allow refuting a fact or an assertion that was made in the prior speech. So rebuttals are also limited to 1 minute. They should start with the assertion that you're refuting. And then you should give some evidence or a brief personal story that contradicts that assertion. So when I call on people, I'll be asking if you'd want to ask a question or offer a rebuttal. And I'll ask that you let me know that right up front. And as you're listening to these speeches, please consider what questions or rebuttals you might want to offer. If you do have a question or you do have a rebuttal, you'll want to raise your Zoom hand. So this is the second and last feature that I'm going to want to make sure everybody understands. Raising your Zoom hand is usually done by pressing a button at the bottom of your screen, but you also might need to click on a reactions icon. Or if you're on a phone, you need to click the 3 little dots. But everybody should try it now. See if you can raise your Zoom hands. We should see a whole bunch of little hands going up. Great. Great. I'd say we're pretty darn good at Zoom. Okay, thanks. And then you can press that button again to lower it. This is the last kind of rule for the evening. When you ask a question or make a rebuttal, I'll ask that you address it to me, the chair. So please always refer to the speaker or the questioner instead of using their names. And so, for example, if the prior speaker was Jack Smith, you shouldn't ask, Jack, how can you possibly say X, Y, and Z? Instead, you need to address your question or your rebuttal to me and say, for instance, Mr. Chair, could the prior speaker please clarify why they said X, Y, and Z? And the reason we do this is we want to avoid getting personal or asking gotcha questions. Everyone here should feel respected and safe in expressing their thoughts. And as the chair, the one thing I will not tolerate is a personal attack, any kind of rudeness or incivility. It's super important, and it's what makes these Braver Angels debates work. Last but not least, if you have any need of technical assistance of any kind, Rao Talasila is here and standing by, and you can contact him by phone or by text, and Terry will put Rao's contact information into the chat window. And with that, it's time to start the debate. So tonight, we're here to debate the resolution, resolved, free market forces will never be enough to address climate change. The government needs to play a strong role. I want to call this debate to order, and I'd like to ask for a first speech in the affirmative from Abby Brockway. So Abby, you can unmute yourself and you have 4 minutes. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks, Cliff. My name's Abby Brockway, and in one way I feel a little underqualified to be an invited speaker to discuss climate policy and free markets. I looked at the list of speakers and was blown away by the caliber of people invited to be here. And I don't have the credentials that the others have. But when thinking about this further, I believe that this is exactly why that I should be here, because what we need to do is to transform and reimagine how we do absolutely everything, which is going to be really uncomfortable. But it's important that each of us does what we think we cannot do. So I'm showing up to be a model, an example of being uncomfortable, even when we feel inconsequential. And I just want to start a little bit about who I am and what angle I might fit into this conversation. I'm a mom, and I'm a lay leader of a small Presbyterian church. I'm an artist, and I'm a painting contractor that owns a small business in Washington State. I think I might have been asked to be here because I'm sometimes called an activist or an environmentalist. And I try to shed these labels because it's a stereotype that's sometimes unhelpful. But yes, a government should do more to address climate. And we, the people, are the government. In 2014, I and 4 others blocked a mile-long oil train that was headed to Anacortes. And we did this because we believed we had no other legal or reasonable alternatives. Our climate situation is that dire. We, the 5 of us, plus many supporters, took this action, and we were willing to pay whatever consequences lay before us, because it is only in this way that we could have our day in court, where a jury of our peers could hear expert testimony and consider the necessity defense, answering the question, was it necessary to break the law in order to prevent a great harm? And we believe that it was. The West Coast has redefined these descriptions of activists and environmentalists when unlikely groups of all kinds had banded together to defeat over 24 fossil fuel development and expansion projects. And the approval of those projects would have made the West Coast the prime exporter of fossil fuels to China. If we, the diverse groups that we were, did not come together to defeat these projects, Washington State would have been a completely unrecognizable place. And there might have even been drilling in the Arctic if we didn't chase shell oil away. I'm fiscally conservative and believe that we need to live within our means. And in the same spirit, I believe that we need to live within a carbon budget that science, not scientists, but science itself has outlined, because we cannot harm the messenger. And yes, the government needs to do more to be a part of a solution, and it will not be enough. But we, the people, are part of the government, and we are the body, as Apostle Paul would say. And because many of us do not have money, power, or status that some do, I believe it is necessary to pressure the governments to do more, because they represent us. And we will be uncomfortable with these transitions, but that is what growth looks like. This work we do is not an eco-fad. It is an eco-emergency. Thank you.
Jazz hands. Thank you so much, Abby, for kicking off this discussion. If you have a question or a rebuttal for Abby, for the prior speaker, please raise your Zoom hand and you can address that to me as the chair. I see a question from Linda McCoy. Linda, can you unmute yourself and either let me know if you want a question or a rebuttal, and then address it to me.
It's a question. And the question is there any kind of proposal being put together to put before the state legislature regarding the kind of protections that you're talking about, Abby?
And again, instead of referring to Abby, just, I know you're our first questioner, so Linda,
Yeah.
I'm not picking on you, but you would want to say, with the prior speaker, does the prior speaker
with the
know?
prior speaker.
Yep. So Abby, please go ahead and answer that question.
So I'm not clear about the question. Is there any legislation about what?
about creating the protections that you're talking about?
I guess I'm unsure about which protections as far as
Okay,
the fossil fuels.
yeah,
I mean, I just would say that I've been to Olympia with a bunch of people, and we definitely keep trying to increase protections so that the commons are protected just as much as business and other entities.
okay, thanks.
Thanks for that question, Linda. And then I'm going to call on Michael Blown. Michael, unmute yourself, please, and address the question to me.
Yes, Cliff. My question, similar to the last question, it's what kinds of actions can the government, should the government be taking? Are there general categories of actions that the government should do that the free market cannot do or won't do?
Thanks for that question. Abby, go ahead.
I actually don't think that I need to answer that question. I think if other people have better better answers to that, I think that's a really good question, and it's a big question. So I'm just mindful of the time, and I don't think I have the best contribution to that answer.
Okay, thank you so much for both. That's wonderful speech and the questions, and another round of jazz hands. And I'd like to call our next speaker, who leans, I think, towards the con position, but may be somewhat nuanced. And I'll let him clarify that one way or the other. Yoram, you're up.
All right. Thanks. It's great to be here with all of you. See some old friends from Seattle. My name is Yoram Bauman. I'm an environmental economist by training. Spent 20 years in Seattle. I live in Salt Lake City now. In terms of the resolution, free market forces will never be enough to address climate change. The government needs to play a strong role. I think I have 4 things that I want to say about this. So first of all, there's a strong economic case for concern and for smart government action. So if you're familiar with the prisoner's dilemma or the tragedy of the commons, these are cases that economists call market failures, where Adam Smith's invisible hand doesn't work and you end up with potentially bad outcomes. So think traffic congestion or overfishing or pollution, which climate change is an example of. So that's point number 1. There's a strong economic case for concern and for smart government action. Point number 2 is that I'm a little hesitant about the resolution because never is a very strong word. Free market forces will never be enough to address climate change. I kind of caution you, never say never. Sometimes we get lucky. And I guess the example that I'll give here is actually the article that was called The Tragedy of the Commons that Garrett Hardin published in the journal Science in 1968. And the issue that he was talking about there was population growth, human population growth. And he went through all the arguments about, basically if everybody wants to have 4 kids, then population is going to grow and grow and grow. And he argued that freedom to breed was intolerable. Okay, and I think we now see that even though populations are going to be pretty high, maybe 10 or 11 billion on the planet, right? It seems unlikely that they're going to double and double and double forever. And I think we're at a place now where most folks would say, well, we don't need, one child policy kind of approaches in terms of government action. So I would say sometimes we get lucky, right? And maybe a miracle will occur and, solar and wind and renewables will come down below the price of fossil fuels and we won't need more government policy. But I wouldn't bet on that. Right. And so point number 3 that I want to make here is that economists agree that the best solution, if we're going to take government action, the best solution is to internalize externalities by putting a price on carbon. Right. So the economics of something like climate change is that there are external costs associated with our activities. When we turn on the lights or fly or drive, then there are third parties all around the world in the case of climate change who are bearing the impacts of our activities. And we're not paying the true price of those activities. And so the way to correct that market failure is to use market forces to create a surrogate for these missing market signals by doing something like a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. both of which are going to drive up the price of fossil fuels and provide incentives for everybody, individuals, households, businesses, utilities, to move in a more sustainable direction. So when it comes to what we could do or should do about climate policy, I think there's a strong tendency for economists, myself included, to like the idea of putting a price on carbon. The last point I want to make is that there are pocketbook-friendly ways to do this, including at a state level. And I'll give you two examples. I was the founder and co-chair of the Initiative 732 campaign in Washington State. This was in 2016, first ever carbon tax on the ballot in the United States. I want to give some shout outs to some folks who might be on, I think are on the call tonight. So Greg Rock, Cliff Mass, Kate Flammer, Dan Shee, also involved in that campaign. And, you know, we got on the ballot in 2016 and we ended up losing. As I describe it, because of a combination of opposition from folks on the right who were afraid that carbon pricing was socialism, and opposition from folks on the left who were mad that they knew that it wasn't, because our policy was to have a carbon tax and cut the state sales tax. I now live.
Your 4 minutes are up, so just tie it up. Thank you.
I'm working on a campaign here in Utah to replace the state sales tax on groceries with a carbon tax. It's a campaign called Clean the Darn Air, and I'm happy to chat about that if folks are interested. Thank you.
Jazz hands, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Questions or rebuttals? Raise your jazz hand. I'm going to call on Gary Piazzone. Gary, can you unmute yourself and address the question to me?
Yeah, and thank you for getting it almost right. Piazzone, but
Sorry to butcher it.
it's a question for the previous speaker, and maybe two questions. Number one, is a carbon tax going to be effective given the time frames we face? And number two, what was your fourth point?
Thank you for that question and for buying time. Yoram, go ahead.
I mean, there are political constraints for all kinds of policies. That includes carbon pricing. But if you had the political will to do it, then you could have a carbon price that would accomplish whatever kind of whatever goal you wanted to seek, right? Like if you wanted a $100 per ton carbon tax, that would be $1 a gallon of gasoline. That would be a lot, or $200 a ton. And the political constraints that you face there are similar to the political constraints that you'd face if you wanted to, ban gas-powered vehicles in the next 5 years or something like that. The fourth point I made, in fact, was that there are pocketbook-friendly ways to address climate change. And I'll make a fifth point, which is that everybody should consider buying a copy of my book, since I'm a good capitalist. It's called The Cartoon Introduction to Climate Change, and it's a second edition. So there you have it, my self-interested capitalist plug.
All right, thanks for that self-interested capitalist plug. And we have time for another question. I'm going to call in Dick Burkhart. Dick, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I have a question that's also related to timing issues. One of the problems with climate change is that once things start to get bad, you may have passed tipping points, and it's going to be really hard to catch up. And the problem with free markets is that free markets tend to, at least these days, have a very short time frame. So by the time you get people energized to solve things, and entrepreneurs and business people get energized to solve things, you run into you're way behind the time frame. And my question is, what can be done about that in terms of free market capitalism? Or, I mean, carbon taxes are maybe one thing, but then politically, again, sometimes you run into the same issues there. By the time you can pass the carbon tax, it's too late sometimes, or it's not enough.
Thanks for that question.
I guess I would caution folks about a potential source of confusion here, and this came in for me through the resolution itself. Carbon taxes are a market-based policy, but they are not a free market policy, right? It is government involvement in the economy in the same way that antitrust activities is government involvement in the economy. So I would be very careful to make a distinction between saying, let's just have laissez-faire, let's let everybody do their own thing. We don't need any government, and saying, let's have a role for government, but let's have the role for government be small government, pocketbook friendly, market-based approach. And that's kind of where I come from. In terms of the politics is hard, right? I mean, I'm not going to deny that. I happen to think that carbon taxes are a good way forward. That's where I put my energies. But, there are folks out there who think that the way to address climate change is to overthrow the cisgender capitalist heteropatriarchy. And what I say to folks like that is bless you, go do it. And so everything is hard in climate policy, I think. And it's important to keep that in mind and not go into it, I think, with this feeling of, well, this is the only way to do it, and I'm going to oppose all other ways of doing it. I kind of go through it and say, hey, here's the policies that I work on and that I support, but that doesn't mean that I oppose other policies.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Yoram. Jazz hands for our speaker. And I'd like to call up our next speaker, who I believe leans in the affirmative. It would be Philip Mote. Phil, you can unmute and you have 4 minutes for your speech.
Well, thanks for having me, and hello, everyone. So I've been a climate scientist since being a graduate student at the UW in the early 1990s. And in those roughly 30 years, climate change went from a worry among a small group of scientists to a reality for the whole planet. My scientific papers went from trying to predict the future to documenting the sad unfolding reality. At the same time, politically, I went from, I would say, right of center. I volunteered for McCain in 2008 to maybe a little lefter as I watched the failure of conservatism to conserve our planet. So my motivations in thinking about this problem come from the twin convictions that science pursues truth, ever unfolding truth as we see it, and that God calls humans to care for each other and for the planet, not to maximize profit. So just briefly, why are we concerned about this? The science boils down to 3 statements. It's real, it's us, and it's bad. Real warming is unequivocal. We've seen multiple lines of evidence from temperature records, but also melting ice and a lot of other things. It's us. By burning coal, oil, natural gas, and other activities, forestry and agriculture, we're inexorably and rapidly raising the quantities of heat-trapping gases. When I was born, CO2 in the atmosphere was 320 parts per million. It's now 420 parts per million, which is about 50% above pre-industrial. By altering the energy budget of the planet, we have probably changed the nature of every naturally occurring extreme event. So it is likely that Hurricane Ian is stronger than it would have been had we not added 50% more CO2 to the atmosphere. There's also strong evidence that the huge increase in forest fires in the West and other changes are attributable to that change in the planetary energy balance. So that's a brief thumbnail of the science. My expertise is not in policy, but the resolution is a policy question. But I have watched this issue for 30 years. So a couple of observations. Number one, publicly traded companies answer to shareholders, not to the future. So they have strong disincentives to improve the future for the human race, unless it increases their value in the eyes of shareholders now. We've seen substantial reductions in per capita emissions and aggregate US emissions. So Oregon, for example, Oregon's emissions peaked in the late 90s and the US in 2007 without a whole lot of government intervention. So I can sort of see the argument that maybe we don't need to do more, but that's the low-hanging fruit. The free market actually still plays by rules, and Dr. Bauman sort of alluded to this. So the rules ideally are an expression of the will of the people, not just of shareholders. So how the will of the people is conveyed into the sideboards for the free market is important. The issue of externalities, which include the tragedy of the commons, that is the incentive for private parties to take advantage of a resource that's unconstrained, externalities are a way of including that in the price of a good. So a carbon tax is one way, although not the only way, to show that price. And some kind of government action or a very strong citizen initiative, as Dr. Bauman led, would be required to do that. I just want to close with this comment. I cannot think of one single large environmental problem that has ever been solved without vigorous government involvement. Acid rain, air pollution, water pollution, ozone depletion, deforestation, overfishing, those have been solved by strong government action. So I just don't see a way we can take the next step in achieving a stable climate without government intervention.
Thank you very much. Jazz hands for the speaker. And if there are questions for the prior speaker, please raise your hand. If there are rebuttals, raise your hand as well, and I'll call on two folks. Sue Lonnie Madsen, if you can unmute yourself and address your question to me, please.
I would be interested in knowing how the previous speaker reached the conclusion that a stable climate is actually possible when there's no record anywhere that the climate has ever been stable.
Thanks for that question.
So since the dawn of human civilization during about 10,000 years ago, carbon dioxide stayed pretty close to 180 parts per million, and the temperature fluctuated within the limits of what we've seen in the last 100 years, approximately, and the global average. So that's what I refer to as a stable climate, the global temperature not fluctuating by more than about 1 degree Celsius over multi-decadal timeframes. Now, even after we stabilize the global temperature, there will still be substantial catch-up that the ocean and the ice sheets do. So we'll continue to see sea level rise and the gradual obliteration of low elevations even after we've stabilized global temperatures.
Thanks very much for that answer. And for the next question, I want to call on Charles and Nancy Bagley. Please unmute yourself and ask your question to me.
Yeah, Cliff and everybody, sorry to be slow. I want to point out that, in fact, solar power now is the cheapest electric power source, cheaper than gas, cheaper than coal, cheaper than oil. And so pricing is good. Secondly, if a steadily increasing carbon tax is written into the bill that cannot be altered arbitrarily by subsequent presidents, then companies will look ahead to read the writing on the wall, and they'll say, we have to switch now to alternate fuel sources and not wait until we're going bankrupt. So their message to their stockholders is, we're going to preserve our dividends by switching with the law and the times. Thank you.
Oh, okay, thanks. So no question there, but that was a statement. Thank you.
I do want to add that I have solar panels on my roof and I use them to power my electric vehicle. So I like to say that I fly on photons.
All right. Thank you very much, Phil. Appreciate your speech. Appreciate you being here. I'd like to go to our next speaker, who will be speaking in the negative, John Christie. John, could you please unmute yourself? You have 4 minutes.
All right, thank you very much from Alabama here, and I see some folks I recognize on your show there. I want to speak against the resolution by emphasizing that the U.S. government or any government cannot control our fairly stable climate. There have been many legislative attempts to reduce CO2 emissions, thinking they control the climate, and I was often asked to testify as to the actual effectiveness of these ideas in the real world. As someone who produces global atmospheric temperatures from satellites each month, I was able to show that none of the initiatives would create a climate response that was detectable, so I tried something else. I looked at the case in which the United States disappeared from the Earth. No people, no cars, no factories, no planes. The impact of this catastrophe was about 1/10 of a degree by 2100, an amount so small it's lost in the noise of global temperatures because they bounce around more than that from month to month. I've testified before Congress 20 times, numerous state houses, and in federal court as an expert witness. In none of these cases was my testimony about the impacts of legislation rebutted. My claim stood up to vigorous cross-examination. Fortunately, CO2 is non-toxic. It's not poison. It's plant food. We know that the world is more agriculturally productive because of the extra CO2 we put back into the atmosphere where it had been. In addition, the availability of carbon-based energy has led to the healthiest, longest-lived population in history. So CO2 represents many undisputed benefits. But does it affect the climate? CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It can't not be a greenhouse gas. But the impacts of the extra CO2 are tiny, as they amount to about 2 watts versus Mother Nature's 500 watts that pour down on the earth from the sun and the atmosphere each second. So you see, it is a tiny push on a huge and variable system, which is why it is so hard to detect its impacts. I do considerable work on what the climate has done, including out west where I'm originally from. Since the 19th century, I can say that noticeable precipitation changes have not occurred, whether they be snowfall, heavy rain events, or total precipitation. Even metrics like daily record high temperatures, and I've got the evidence right here, are not occurring more often in your part of the country, even with the blast furnace you all had to live through back in 2021. While the background temperature has risen slightly, perhaps due to extra CO2, there is no significant change in the weather you really care about. So there is little to support the claim that extra CO2 has done something harmful to the climate. Finally, I lived in Africa, where I taught physics and chemistry in a rural upcountry part of Kenya. I witnessed devastating poverty. Now, I happen to believe that all human life is precious, and I lived in a situation where it was obvious that without energy, life was impoverished, brutal, and short. These Kenyans, our fellow human cohort, will do what we did and find affordable energy to enable these precious humans not to just survive, but to thrive. This is not an opinion. This is what is happening despite the lecturing they receive from the rich world, who, by the way, as classic hypocrites we are, find ourselves with increasing emissions overall. So, government energy policies designed to restrict carbon and affordable energy won't impact the climate enough to notice, but you can be sure they will make our lives, especially those of our poorest neighbors, even more difficult. Let the cleverness of people discover how to generate affordable and reliable energy in new ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Jazz hands for our speaker. And John, that was exactly 4 minutes. So impressive use of time. If you have a question or a rebuttal for the speaker, raise your hand. And I'm going to go to, I don't know what your name is, but your Zoom name is The Clucks. And if you could unmute yourself and ask your question, or let me know if you have a rebuttal.
I have a rebuttal to this because the thing is that the temperature records by NOAA have been tampered with. This has been proven as there has been congressional testimony led by Ted Cruz and others. NOAA admitted they tampered with the records. The media admits it too, to say they fixed the records because it didn't go along with the CO2 apocalypse theory. The other speaker hit it out of the ballpark. On top of that, we keep on saying that solar and wind is going to save everyone when it's the worst form of energy that we could ever have. You have to go through all kinds of industrialization, and you're going to have to cook up all those chemicals to make your solar panels with some kind of heat, and you're going to probably end up using natural gas. You're going to have, they produce tons and tons of toxic waste. And in 20 years, it all becomes toxic waste. You want to try to recycle those rare earth minerals, you're going to have to burn even more energy. It exploits children in the third world. Women and children are getting cancer in those third world because there's no PPE. They have to just strip mine and just destroy the place. You'll never be able to ever mine enough rare earth minerals for this toxic form of energy that you want to use that kills thousands and thousands of birds of prey. That CO2 doesn't kill anybody. CO2 doesn't kill birds.
Sir, thank you for thank you for those comments. I really appreciate it. I wanted to do one clarification, and that is that for a rebuttal, you want to be addressing a point that was made by the prior speaker specifically. And while I really appreciate your comments, I think that they more kind of constitute a speech. So for you who are invited to ask additional questions and rebuttals or give a speech, I just want to clarify that if you'd like to give a speech, you should reach out to your whip. And I want to thank you for those comments. And now I'm going to go.
That's what you said. And that's
Thank you. Yep. Thanks very much. So I want to go to the next question or rebuttal. And I've got a tough domestic issue here because my wife has raised her hand. And I think if I don't call on her, I'm going to be in deep trouble. So I'm going to do two more, one including Nelda Swiggett. You can unmute yourself and ask a question or offer a
Smart guy.
You need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to ask the prior speaker the question is, on what evidence does he say that his assertions regarding climate change have never been rebutted? Because when I look online, I did a quick search on his name, and I see website after website, climate misinformation, testing climate claims, Professor John Christie incorrectly claims. I could just keep on reading down the list. Climate change denier, you know, it just keeps on going down. I don't have time, of course, to check into these things, but I'm wondering how, you know, what his evidence to claim that his assertions have never been questioned or, yeah, that's my question.
All right, thanks for that question. But John,
All right. Believe it or not, everything you read on the web is not true. I don't know if you've ever come across that, but that's a point you might want to remember. And I spoke about congressional legislation, depositions, court testimony. You can even read in the Vermont case where the judge said in the opinion, and James Hansen, who was the NASA scientist testifying on the other side of the issue I was presenting, could not contradict Dr. Christie's information. And so that's what I was referring to, on the record testimony with facts, figures, and those about the legislation, specifically are about legislative effects or the climate effects of legislation. Those were not rebutted.
okay, thank you very much. Jazz hands, we really appreciate you joining us from Alabama, John. Thanks for being here. And of course, all speakers are welcome to stick around and ask questions, offer rebuttals, participate fully in the debate. So I want to move to our next speaker, and who will be speaking in the affirmative, and invite Sarah Doherty to unmute yourself, Sarah, and you have 4 minutes for a speech.
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. I wanted to frame this in terms of the things that inform my position on this issue. So I, like Phil, am also an atmospheric physicist. So I'm pretty aware of where the consensus stands on the science of this issue. I could just repeat everything he said. You know, climate change is happening. It's caused by human activities. Importantly, it's therefore preventable. Yes, climate has changed in the long past, but right now we're actively changing climate and we have a choice not to do so. And if we don't act rapidly, there's going to be major disruptions to social systems, physical systems, and therefore lots of suffering and loss, both human and economic, with the two being really linked. So just like you can find, I'm sure you can find doctors out there who will tell you, well, smoking is not really that bad for you. It's just a little bit of smoke in your lungs. You know, it's not really a big problem. I think we all agree that the consensus of the medical community is that you don't want to smoke. It causes cancer. Similarly, you can cherry pick data. You can find individual arguments that kind of appear to refute climate change as a large issue. But the scientific community, the consensus is very clear that we are facing a major problem here. So that's one thing that informs my position on this issue. I also believe in well-regulated capitalism. I'm not a socialist, and I also don't think the government is always the most effective at providing solutions. But I also know that the free market, while it can choose to make decisions that are based not only on profits, it's the exception that it would do so and not the norm. And so I think, for reasons that people have spoken to here already, the government really does have an absolutely critical role in providing both incentives and regulations that are necessary to account for the potential damages resulting from the fact that the free market does not internalize many of the costs and impacts of the things that it supports, especially those things that act on a really long time scale, or things where the impacts are distributed across the whole globe or to people in the future, and not just to the individual consumer in the moment. So business is just not structured to account for those kind of externalities, and so government really has to play a role. The third thing is that I believe that as humans, we have a moral obligation to people other than ourselves, as well as to other creatures on the earth. In particular, when actions we're taking could knowingly cause harm to others. Businesses carry no such moral obligation. And certainly climate change is a case where we are taking actions that we really do know will cause harm in the near future. We've known about climate change for decades, as Phil said, and that absent any significant action, climate change is coming, and that it's going to result in deep and long-standing suffering. And the market has known this for some time. The reinsurance industry is a great example of this. For over 20 years, they've been quite concerned about climate change because of the costs it's going to put on them. And yet, despite that, businesses and the free market has demonstrably not responded sufficiently, which isn't to say it hasn't responded at all, but it's not responded sufficiently. So I don't really see how you could argue that the free market will somehow take care of this problem to the degree that's needed on the timeline it's needed. I love this country. And to me, climate change is truly an existential risk, not just to the individuals or wildlife of this country, but to the security of the country and the world. And this is not just my opinion. Starting in the Bush administration, the Pentagon, they rank the risks to national security. And the #1 ranking for long-term national security of this country since the Bush administration has been climate change. So that this is the military telling you that climate change is a major long-term risk to the country. So just let that sort of sink in.
Heads up that if you could wrap it up, that'd be great.
Yep. Well, and that's my final point is, just like we don't leave the defense of our country to the free market, I don't think we should leave addressing the risk of climate change fully to the free market. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jazz hands. I know 4 minutes goes by fast, and we all have a lot to say on this topic. Questions or rebuttals for the prior speaker? I want to call on Bernard Seeger. If you could unmute yourself, Bernard, and ask your question to me.
Thank you. Yeah, if the previous speaker could clarify something that I often hear in conversations is, look, the climate's always changing, so why are you worried about it? And basically it's in God's hands. And my understanding of the science is, yes, the climate has always changed, but it's the rate of change. Can you give a little more information behind that? Because I feel like that's a very common thing I hear when I talk to folks about this conversation. And they seem to confuse the fact that we had an ice age where no humans were at, and now where, we have plenty of humans, and it's like, what's the difference? Thank you.
Thanks for that question.
Yeah. So I mean, the climate has always changed, but it's changed. First, there's a number of things. It's in the past, it's changed at a quite slow rate. So the difference in temperature and global annual average temperature between now and an ice age is sort of a degree and a half Celsius. It's really small. And that same amount of change in the other direction, we're imposing on the planet in about 150 years. Whereas in an ice age, that change occurs over thousands of years. So the rate of change is much, much faster that we're imposing. It's something that we're imposing that we don't need to be imposing. Even if you want to be really big picture about it, you could say, well, eventually the sun's going to blow up, the whole Earth's going to, disappear, and we're all going to die anyway. So why give a damn, right? But the fact is, right now, we are at a naturally very stable period of the climate history, and it would remain stable for quite a bit longer if we weren't out there pushing the system and adding CO2 to the atmosphere. So it's a choice we're making. To me, it's a choice that we're making to do something that we know is going to cause rapid climate change that our social and economic systems are not prepared for. And so there will be suffering. So it's really a value choice. Do you do that on purpose, knowing that you're doing it?
Thank you for that answer. And Joy Olson, could you unmute yourself and let me know if you have a question or a rebuttal?
I have a question. When the speaker is speaking about government taking over and setting restrictions, limitations, new rules, all the things we are talking about with the government being involved in changing climate activity, she's talking about the United States. And I'm wondering how people who want the US to be taking on these additional burdens and costs evaluate the question of what do we do with respect to our power internationally relative to, say, China and other places where the vast majority of the US's or the world's population is. How far can we influence things if it's just us? Mm-hmm. And are there risks of us adding costs to our system and maybe weakening our economic system relative to other players in the world?
Thank you for that question.
Yeah, so I mean, in a lot of ways, I would sort of argue it the other way. So I think the US stands in a position where it's really an opportunity to, well, there's a couple of things. I think we have a real opportunity to be investing in alternative energies that are going, are needed anyhow. And so it's an opportunity to for the government to support the development of new technologies and energy systems that can be then sold to other countries. I mean, we've seen solar has gone to China because the government pulled support from behind solar. So now a lot of the solar industry is out of China when it could be out of here. We could be selling those solar panels rather than China. Sort of on the other side of it is also that by the US government taking action, we act as a role model. There's a sort of soft power role to be had here, where if we want other countries to step up in this problem, we need to step up on this problem. A lot of the rest of the world is going to be more likely to act if we do. So I think that's there's benefits to be had in terms of soft power and respectability in the international political arena, but I think there's also just enormous business opportunities. The US government is currently pouring an enormous amount of money in subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. It's not like we're not spending the money. We're spending it in the wrong place is the problem. It's just, it's not a good investment right now. So I think we could, make different investments that would end up paying off by providing the right incentives.
Thank you for that answer. And thank you for that speech. Jazz hands. Really appreciate you being here. I want to move to our next speaker who will be speaking in the negative on the resolution. Todd Myers. Can you, Todd, unmute yourself? You have 4 minutes, and thanks for your speech.
Thank you so much. I want to start off with a very important point, which is that the Mariners are up 3-1. So I am the environmental director at the Washington Policy Center in Seattle. And the question tonight is whether market forces will be enough to address climate change. After working more than 2 decades in environmental policy and at government agencies, I've realized that the more concerned you are about climate change, the more you should support market-based approaches because political approaches are failing badly. Washington State, King County, and Seattle have missed every single CO2 target badly, despite spending hundreds of millions of dollars and adding many new regulations. Washington's failure has been particularly pronounced because, given the governor's claim that he's a climate leader. Washington used to have a climate dashboard with metrics measuring our progress reducing emissions. But when the state was missing virtually all of them, the webpage was actually shut down just a couple of months before the governor announced his presidential campaign. And earlier this month, Washington State announced that state agencies had failed to meet their legal obligation that 20% of the fuel that they use be biofuel. The actual amount that they used was 11%. And this is the 13th year in a row that they have failed to meet their legally obligated target. Government approaches fail because the incentive to adopt policies is to make politicians look good, not necessarily policies that work. When government program fails, politicians simply deny it. When was the last time you ever heard a politician admit that they screwed up? Once we are locked on a path of failure in government, it's very hard to get off that path. The great innovator Buckminster Fuller once said, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change things, you create a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And market-based innovation is doing exactly that. This is the approach that Microsoft, Google, Walmart, and Amazon are taking. All of them have set targets to reduce CO2 emissions far beyond any legal requirement. These companies report their results and are on track to meet their goals. And actually, unlike government, many are exceeding their goals. One of the biggest opportunities to reduce CO2 emissions is to shift people from using electricity during peak hours, when it is most expensive and carbon intensive, to times of the day when renewables are available. In the UK and Texas, a utility called Octopus Energy reduces rates when renewables are available, even paying people to use electricity when there is too much wind. We can't even choose a utility like that in Washington State. But perhaps the best example of how markets drive environmental innovation is the Prius. For nearly 2 decades, the Prius was the vehicle of choice for those concerned about climate change. But hybrids weren't created in response to government regulations or incentives. Politicians didn't know what a hybrid was in the 1990s. Toyota saw an opportunity to profit by marketing to energy-conscious consumers. Now, politicians later jumped on the bandwagon and provided tax incentives, but market-driven innovation led the way and politicians followed. Now, to be sure, the argument isn't that government should do nothing. I'm not an anarchist, as you can tell by the fact I'm not wearing black, but top-down government planning has consistently failed to live up to its promises. Outsourcing important environmental issues to politicians is a false hope. With politics, we are always one election away from changing course. It is time to empower people, not politicians, to take action on climate change. By democratizing environmentalism using market forces, we can reward people for reducing CO2 emissions and saving energy in a way that is durable and effective. So I've mentioned just a few examples of how that works, but my new book, since I'll also pitch it, called Time to Think Small, which is available on Amazon, outlines many other ways people across the globe are turning to innovation, not government, to solve our most difficult environmental problems. And with that, I will stop and take questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Todd. Jazz hands for our speaker, and go Mariners. If you have a question or a rebuttal for the prior speaker, please raise your hand. And I would like to call on Sharon Lonergan, if you could unmute yourself and let me know if you have a question or a rebuttal.
I actually have a question for the prior speaker. I was wondering if he could comment on the rapid market shift towards electric vehicles away from hybrids. And electric vehicles seem to pose a lot of problems for the environment. And of course, they're outrageously expensive and really increase a lot of our energy use as we have to charge the vehicles at night. And of course, we're seeing California is having an issue with that. So how do we get to a point where something that seems to be worse for the environment has become the go-to?
That's a great question. So there's a couple of parts there. The first is that one reason that hybrids emerged was in the 1990s, California actually tried to mandate a certain percentage of electric vehicles, but the technology wasn't even ready. And so what emerged instead was hybrids. So politicians tried to chart a particular course that didn't exist, and the market actually found the better approach. Now we're moving to EVs. And of course, EVs have been pioneered, we've talked about it for a long time, by Elon Musk, who is, for all his other flaws, a ardent capitalist, right? I mean, he wants to make money. So that's where the innovation is coming from. You raise a good point about the environmental trade-offs, but the question is, what are you more concerned about? If you're more concerned about climate change, it is clear that EVs will reduce CO2 emissions, especially here in Washington State, where our electricity is so clean. If you're more concerned about the effects of mining, the effect on, you know, labor practices in developing countries where we get those minerals, then maybe you don't like electric vehicles. Maybe you're more concerned about those things. But it's not clear cut. It's a trade-off. Yeah.
Thanks very much for that answer. And I want to call on Miles McPhee. Miles, could you please unmute yourself and let me know if you have a question or a rebuttal?
Hi, this is a question for the previous speaker. A recent article or section in Science magazine addressed the issue of relocation. And there were several sub-articles in that outlining the problems. But my question for the speaker is, given the present state at which governments can handle the refugee problem, how is the free market going to handle vast refugee problems as the climate warms?
Thank you very much for that question.
I think there's two aspects to that. The first is, how do you prevent the climate from warming in the first place so you don't have those? And as I laid out, the best bet you have is for free market innovation and not in government policies. People talk about market failures, but I think we see government failures all the time. And I think, as you point out, governments are having a hard time dealing with refugees. But the other issue is that what we see in the United States, where we have a more market-based economy, is that we see people coming in, and we actually, my opinion is, we need more immigration. I mean, I think, you know, that people are coming here, they're not going to countries that are impoverished. So the market is effectively dealing with those, and people are flocking here because we have a strong market economy. But more to the point of the resolution, the question is, how do we prevent that? And the way that we prevent climate change from creating those sorts of waves of climate refugees is to use market innovation, not rely on government solutions.
Thanks very much. Jazz hands for our speaker. And I just want to encourage everybody, if you're interested in making a speech, please reach out to your whip and let them know. And we're going to move to our next speaker, who is in the affirmative, Doug Ray. Could you please unmute yourself? And you have 4 minutes.
Great, thanks. Hi, everybody. My name is Doug Ray. I'm the chair of the board of directors of Carbon Washington, a nonprofit in Washington that advocates for smart climate action. By that, I mean we favor economically progressive and efficient approaches to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions and thereby arrest climate change, clean up the air we breathe, and save human lives. I want to emphasize cleaning up the air we breathe because it will save lives and it is completely under our control. Other speakers have mentioned this next point, which is to minimize climate change, we and all the other major emitting nations of the world have to stop burning fossil fuels, which is a tall order, not entirely within our control. But the air we breathe will be cleaner and fewer people in Washington will suffer or die prematurely, even if only we in Washington stop burning fossil fuels. And this is 100% under our control. Now to the resolution. I think the governments must do more if we intend to arrest climate change and limit global warming to 1.5, 2, or even 3 degrees Celsius. Consistent with what the previous speaker said, I am not aware of any time in human history when pollution or environmental degradation has been substantially reduced without government playing a significant role. And I don't think that's going to change. There are many success stories from which we can learn. Sadly, there are also examples of ineffective solutions from which we should learn what not to do. Addressing climate change is particularly challenging because access to affordable, reliable energy is highly correlated with prosperity and economic development, which means that access to affordable, reliable energy reduces poverty. And this is certainly a very good thing. Thus, in my opinion, we should not sacrifice affordable, reliable energy in our quest to address climate change. So what should we do? Well, for sure, the federal government should significantly increase investment in pre-competitive research aimed at cost-effectively reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There are lots of examples where research has yielded reduced greenhouse gas emissions. Perhaps most significantly was the development of new underground drilling technology based on federally funded research that yielded dramatic reductions in emissions in the United States by replacing coal with natural gas in the production of electricity. Second, we have to eliminate marketplace deficiencies associated with energy production, storage, and use. Thus, we really should no longer allow emissions of greenhouse gases to be free. Otherwise, we functionally continue to incentivize the burning of fossil fuels. The most economically efficient way to do this is to put a price on greenhouse gas emissions, which we have partially done in Washington state. Similarly, we should eliminate tax breaks for fossil fuels and instead put in place mechanisms to help less wealthy people with lower incomes afford clean energy and greenhouse gas emission reductions. Third, we should enact and change where appropriate taxes, incentives, and regulations regarding land use to accelerate greenhouse gas emission reductions, for example, to make it easier to build in cities and reduce sprawl. Fourth, we really need to unleash investments in energy efficiency and clean energy by private capital. The cost to transform our energy system is enormous. Government can't afford it by itself. So that process will be greatly accelerated if we are able to unleash private capital. The most important step to take in this area is to establish robust standards for climate or green bonds so investors can be assured that their investments will deliver reduced emissions. And finally, in all that we do, we really need to make sure that less wealthy people with lower incomes do not pay a disproportionate share of the costs of arresting climate change. An effective way to do this is to replace or reduce regressive taxes while pricing greenhouse gas emissions, and to provide dividends or subsidies to less wealthy people with lower incomes to help them pay for reductions in emissions. We also need to make sure that improvements in air quality target areas with the highest number of people experiencing the effects of air pollution. Today, these are areas populated predominantly by less wealthy people with lower incomes. For sure, we'll develop better solutions if Democrats, Republicans, and independents work together. Thanks for listening. I very much look forward to hearing from others.
Thanks to the speaker. Again, impressive in exactly 4 minutes. And I would like to ask anybody with a question or a rebuttal to raise their hand. I want to call on Terry Stilson. Please unmute yourself, Terry. And
I was wondering early in the speech, the speaker mentioned that there are examples both of success stories with government policies helping to mitigate environmental problems, and then of course also examples of stories where that didn't work out. And I was just wondering if the speaker has, off the top of his head, examples of those success stories. Thank you.
Sure, I guess two come immediately to mind, success stories. One was in the news fairly recently because we built upon it, right? So, I don't know, a bunch of years ago, all the nations in the world got together and signed a treaty, the Montreal Protocol, to eliminate the use of chlorofluorocarbons globally. And, and we've pretty much done that. Just last week, the United States finally signed an amendment, the so-called Kigali Amendment to that treaty, to also eliminate the use of hydrochlorofluorocarbons. So that's a beautiful example. Another example that I think somebody else mentioned earlier too, of course, was the use of cap and trade mechanism to eliminate acid rain in the United States. And so that was a market-based solution that was put in place by the government. So it's kind of a nice partnership between markets and the government to eliminate acid rain in the production, mostly by burning dirty coal. So those are two great examples, I think, where government has had a really significant and positive impact on solving big environmental problems.
thank you for that answer. And we have one more question for the speaker. Alan Falk, can you please unmute yourself and direct your question to me, sir?
Thank you. The previous speaker mentioned something that I'd never heard of before, green bonds. And so my question, one of many questions I'd like to ask him, one is, why don't we have green bonds? Does that have to be provided by the government? Are there any other sources? So why don't they exist now?
Thank you very much for that question.
Pleasure.
So green bonds do exist now at a modest scale in the United States. They're actually much more significant in Europe, and they're starting to become more significant in Asia. And they're not, the government doesn't really get, this is not a government activity, right? So bonds are purchased by private investors, and the bonds well, the government could issue green bonds and investors could buy them, or typically larger companies issue bonds when they want capital to do something. And I think the reason that market has not exploded is because the standards that are in place are weak and not very well constructed. So this is frankly not necessarily a government activity at all. It's a very standard free market, marshaling the free markets to really get some good stuff done, not requiring the government in any way.
Thank you very much. Jazz hands for our speaker. Really appreciate that. And we're now going to move to our next speaker, who is in the negative. And I'd like to ask Jessica Spiegel. Jessica, please unmute yourself, and we look forward to your speech.
Thank you. I'm Jessica Spiegel, and I'm the Senior Director for the Northwest region of Western States Petroleum Association. Thank you for having me today. I'm focused on the portion of the resolution that the government needs to do more and am con. We actually need to dig in and fix our laws. Several major laws have passed in the last few years here in Washington that are, for me, reckless. They are reckless for our economy. They have goals we know scientifically we don't have the technology for. We don't have the infrastructure. They will be costly in addition to that. And based on several studies that look at how to achieve carbon goals, they're not going to get us to the long-term carbon goals we have, which make them reckless for the environment too. I'll use the forced purchase of electric vehicles as an example. This wasn't voted on by the people of Washington, but our legislators voted for it not once, but 2 times. There are 2 different versions. It's confusing. This ban begins in 2026, when about 35% of cars sold in the state must be zero emissions or electric vehicles. That will require an almost 4 times increase in sales in just over 2 years. How do we get there? No one knows. It's a government mandate without a plan. If you look at Governor Inslee's blog from today, they openly share that there's no plan. I guarantee you the infrastructure for EVs is going to be expensive. Think billions of dollars, and take way more time than that. This law discourages hybrids, which environmental organizations argue are a good bridge vehicle for the same timeframes. Let's be honest, electric vehicles don't make sense for everybody. If you live in Seattle, you have a short commute, it's your second or third car, that's great. But what about people in Eastern Washington, Central Washington, along the coast? I have short commutes during the week, but I'm going to go visit my parents in Oregon on the weekend. An EV doesn't work for me. A hybrid might. You should be able to choose what vehicle is best for you, your family, your lifestyle, your business. This is an example of our legislature getting way, way ahead of the market and how people actually live their lives. In fact, this is exactly why the discussion today is so important. In addition to our mandate on electric vehicles, we have a new cap and trade. While other sectors in the economy have free allowances, and there are reasons for that, not transportation fuels. So now we're talking about 2 huge programs focused on transportation. From year 1, our targets are 3 times more aggressive than California. For perspective, California started at about a 1.8% emission reduction per year. Washington starts next year at a 7% emission reduction, again, focused on transportation. That's staggering. What does this mean? Well, if you look at studies, it translates to additional costs of operations to about 47 cents per gallon for gasoline. The Department of Ecology Modeling predicts the program is going to cost taxpayers 4 times what was anticipated when the law passed. So instead of $500 million, I'm talking $2 billion. And that is with ecology doing some weird things with their model. In addition to these 2 policies, there's also a low carbon fuel standard, which focuses on transportation, a couple clean building standards, 2 or 3 clean electricity laws. All of these programs add cost to energy. None of these programs are implemented. Several aren't even started yet. Worse, no agency has been tasked to holistically look at these programs. How are all of these going to work together? How are people going to charge up their cars when there's an ice storm? In California over Labor Day, they told people to stop charging vehicles due to fears of rolling blackouts. What happens if these mandates are wrong? The worst thing that could happen is we get everything so wrong that there's an overreaction and we lose public support for even reasonable climate policy. Climate and energy is so important.
Jessica,
Let's get it right.
You just have about 10 seconds left. Thank you.
And that's why we need to remove mandates and make the programs we have workable. Thank you.
Jazz hands for our speaker. Thank you so much. And I just want to thank all of our speakers. I feel like there have been some really powerful points made and very diverse, and I really appreciate that. If you have a question or a rebuttal for the prior speaker, please raise your hand, and I want to call on Thor Olson. Please unmute yourself, sir, and direct your question to me. Or if you have a rebuttal, let me know.
Yes, my question is, are the costs of this transition any different than the costs in previous, when the United States did the transcontinental railway system, it was extremely expensive. The same with the transition to interstate highway system. And right now, oil and gas receives substantial subsidies. If you factor in all those things, even at the local level, it is known that electric vehicles with the batteries are expected to fall about 90% over the next decade because of the improved chemistries. If you give all these things together, is it really a higher cost given that electric vehicles last twice as long and cost half as much to run?
Well, there's a couple things there, Thor. First, I would note to you that in terms of this conversation around subsidies, I mean, we certainly don't get subsidies in Washington. We're taxed about 3 times refineries in California, and our refineries are competitive with those for selling products. So I don't know what subsidies there are, except there's something about a tax reduction for production, but that has nothing to do with us here in Washington. To your other question, you're talking about things where we actually had the technology at the time in terms of the rail piece. Right now with the electricity, I mean, we have to build all the infrastructure. So I'm trying to imagine in my mind, is this Walmart parking lots of charging stations? I mean, how is this going to work? And I myself want to see what the plan looks like to lay these things out. And how is this all going to work in the next decade? So it's not that these things aren't going to work, but the time frame that they set forward for this is staggering, and I stand by that.
Thank you very much for that answer. And I want to call on Michael from Seattle. If you could unmute yourself and ask your question to me, please.
Thanks. Yeah, understanding that if I'm correct, the previous speaker is a paid lobbyist paid by the fossil fuel industry, and that's the same industry that is trying to deregulate and take away permitting processes that have worked under NEPA right now in the Senate and Congress. And that's the same industry that wants to make sure that they are immune from prosecution for any kind of climate damages. I'm wondering if the previous speaker could explain to us, once the clock runs out, because it's been 30 or 40 years that the fossil fuel industry's been spending millions on misinformation and to prevent any policy from passing. Once the time finally runs out, what will the fossil fuel industry be proposing to take care of all the billions of people and damage to entire ecosystems that they've caused? And when they are, I guess, finally in court, what kinds of policies will the industry want to see laid out so that they can challenge and question those policies?
Thank you for that question.
So I'm not sure if I really can follow the question all the way, but here's how I'm going to answer it, Michael. We have companies that are in our group of members who are investing billions of dollars in hydrogen. They're investing money in charging stations. They're investing money in trying to figure out how, the renewable diesel. I mean, we've got the largest renewable diesel plant in the world has been permitted in California for one of our members. So I think overall, they're spending quite a lot of money, both in R&D and in construction, to build the energy that we need for the future. We also are not stopping the policy. I mean, it's here. And when you look at the cap and trade in Washington, we want to make that program workable. And that's what I said. And when I said not make it go away or stop it, it's how does this function? And right now in the design of it, it's not functional. So That's what I know in terms of what I do for my work.
And thank you for that answer. Jazz hands for our speaker. And I want to propose that we maybe take about 10 seconds to stretch. If everybody would like to do a quick stretch, and I want to thank everybody again for being here. And also it's so impressive. This is a emotionally charged topic. It's a difficult topic. It's complicated. I know people care passionately about it and feel that it's incredibly important to our future. And I commend everyone here for the respect and civility that you brought to the conversation, while also expressing your point of view and your beliefs. So having said that, I'd like to call our next speaker, who I believe will be leaning towards the affirmative, but correct me if I'm wrong. Victor Menaldo, could you please unmute yourself? And we look forward to your speech.
Thanks for having me. I'm a political economist at UW, and I guess my position is, how does the government do something effectively, not whether it should? I'll give a bit of a context in terms of some economic history related to when the government's done well versus poorly when it comes to industrial policy. This is the idea that it might direct technological change or innovation in one direction versus another. So let's think about the US and industrial policy. The premise of industrial policy is that the market doesn't necessarily value all the benefits of a new company or new technology or a sector when it comes to the contribution to knowledge or innovation or national security. The tools for industrial policy are three main ones. It's subsidies, bailing firms out, or nationalizing certain firms and industries. The trade-offs is that it may create inefficiencies and it may involve picking winners and losers. So it's a very political decision often. The US largely has abstained from it historically, and it has a mixed track record in terms of actually satisfying its goals when it chooses to do it. But the few times it's done it right, it's really hit the ball out of the park with like a grand slam home run type thing. The first proponent of industrial policy was Alexander Hamilton, who was a very big fan of manufacturing and thought that the government needed to subsidize it in order to overcome entrepreneurs' risk aversion and some of the advantages that were granted to foreign manufacturers by foreign governments at the time of our independence. The perils of industrial policy were evident right after Alexander Hamilton spoke, because the US Congress passed a bunch of tariffs on imports that didn't help our manufacturers at all. In fact, it really hurt a lot of our manufacturers that competed with foreign exporters. So it was a disaster. The 1920s Jones Act is another infamous idea where goods transported through US ports have to be carried on US built and operated ships. The idea at least was to ensure a steady supply of merchant ships during wartime. Unfortunately, the result is a colossal failure of the shipping industry in the US. We have very small shipping fleets, old ones, inefficient ones that continually need subsidies. Most of our freight has moved to highway and rail because of the expensive costs. And we have 7 active major shipyards compared with 60 in Europe, which never subsidized its shipping to the same degree. Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminum, don't get me started, another abject failure. Many industries that use steel inputs have more expensive products. Very reputable economists have done the math and have looked into the fact that 180,000 plus jobs have been lost and no benefit to national security. So let me put my positive optimist hat on and now say, well, could you actually do this industrial policy the right way? And I'll say, actually, yes, the US government got it right during the Second World War and the Cold War, right? And the idea here is it subsidized early stage research when the commercial payoffs were very uncertain. And it's especially the case because the upfront costs were very high, but it was very easy after those upfront costs for competitors, let's say, to add an additional customer or to have very low costs after that initial investment. So just running through, what did the US do well? It actually was the government and the military, huge catalyst of the computer industry, the digital revolution, whether it be semiconductors or the actual hardware. A lot of what it did right was directed R&D into computers to crack encrypted messages and develop the H-bomb. This was during World War II. After, during the Cold War, basic research into radar, laser, semiconductors, a lot of subsidies for the basic research in terms of electrical engineering, physics, and computer science.
Victor,
Many
just,
yeah.
Yeah, just have a few seconds left here, Coach.
Oh, okay. So let me skip the other stuff on that, but let's just get to the chase, I guess. What can the U.S. do now? The government, I think R&D into battery technology would help because it's a very dirty supply chain when it comes to electric cars still. One of the speakers said that. Interoperability issues, the way it did with the internet in terms of charging stations would help for the infrastructure around EVs. And then subsidized nuclear energy, because to be honest, that's the way out of this, that and a carbon tax. If you put all those together, I think that's how we get through this problem. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Jazz hands for our speaker. Really appreciate you being here. And if you have a question or you'd like to rebut something that Victor said, please raise your hand. And I see Tor, I hope I'm saying your first name correctly. And you can unmute yourself and fire away.
Yes, my question is, are you aware of the batteries being produced and introduced by MIT and Drexel? This is specifically the aluminum sulfur battery and the lithium sulfur battery.
I am not, no.
Okay, good question. Very direct answer. And I'm going to ask Dan Scavezza to unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, you had a lot of really good information the previous speaker did on past incidents. And I'm wondering if you happen to know if you could shed any light about this idea that the Prius success only came about because of market demand, or in fact, was it partly because government regulation on the fleet mileage caused Toyota to want to have a car that had very good mileage so they could sell other big honking SUVs?
Yeah, I think like with anything else in life, it's a bit of both. And without that prodding, maybe we wouldn't have the hybrids, or at least not the accelerated, innovation and what have you. But on the other hand, it really was Toyota innovating because of the opportunities to generate revenues and profits. So create the infrastructure and then allow firms to use price signals, to use investments, to use R&D, to bring things to market. So I think, pretty much that's where we're converging, it seems like. And the one thing I'd say, though, is that might be a success story, but there's a lot of failures. Like it was mentioned by an earlier speaker, trying to bring EVs to market too early, right? So for any success, there's often 5 or 6 failures in the dustbin of history that people don't look at. So I think that's very important in terms of moderating our enthusiasm for the government to dictate necessarily what happens, right? With all due respect to like what I said with the semiconductors and computers, without government help, we wouldn't have the supercomputers we have in our pocket and be able to do the Zoom call. So it's kind of a hard thing to figure it out, especially retrospectively.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jazz hands. And we've just gone through the slate of our initial speakers. I want to again thank them all. That was really helpful to hear from them. And I want to encourage everybody to reach out to their whip if they'd like to make a speech. We're now going to reduce the length of speeches. We're going to have a couple of 3-minute speeches, and then we'll probably pretty quickly go to 2-minute speeches with just one question each. And that way we can hear from as many people as possible. And I again want to encourage everybody, whether or not you think of yourself as an expert, this question of what to do about climate change affects us all. And I would really encourage you all to reach out to your whips if you'd like to make any comments on that topic. So our next speech is going to be a 3-minute speech. And I want to call on Sue Lanny Madsen to unmute yourself, Sue, and floor is yours.
Okay. I'm an architect and a rancher, and I've been working to raise awareness on holistic decision-making and regenerative agriculture practices. And I believe the resolution starts from the wrong premise. Carbon is part of a complex biological cycle, and it is self-adjusting in unexpected ways. And we are biological components within the system. So the question is, how will we adjust and adapt? Previous speakers have discussed an increasing rate of change in atmospheric carbon over time. The greatest anthropogenic impact on climate in human history has been the development of agricultural practices more than 10,000 years ago, expanding exponentially over time and too often mining the soil rather than paying attention to sustainable soil health. Mass irrigation began diverting water, bringing marginal agricultural lands into production that would perhaps have better remained grazing land. Desertification in North Africa over the last 2,000 years and an expanding Sahara have more to do with birthing hurricanes than atmospheric carbon. Like atmospheric carbon and global warming, government action is often a lagging indicator of pollution cleanup. US air pollution peaked in 1950, 20 years before the Clean Air Act. The Montreal Protocol banning was signed after the market had developed a replacement. So the problem is globally managing a non-polluting gas, thinking that it's the thermostat controlling the temperature of the climate, without regard to all the other interactive variables impacting climate, and without regard for the negative impact on developing nations, then that sounds like a stereotypical government job. Wrong target, wrong actions, wrong outcomes. If the problem statement is that mankind needs to develop greater resilience and ability to adapt to a constantly changing climate, and if the problem statement is that we need to be taking better care of an ecosystem that we barely have scratched the surface, literally, in understanding, then market forces are resiliently flexible for the job, as long as we have a better definition of the problem being addressed. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for that speech. And we'll go to one, yep, jazz hands, absolutely. I'd like to call on, your Zoom name is Elizabeth. Elizabeth, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question to me. Elizabeth? Nod your head if you're, oh. There we go. Oh, I guess.
She got it.
No, there you go. You got it.
Oh, okay.
Please,
I had a
Eric.
question. And
Yes.
I was just texting Janice Dickinson. Anyway, my question is, and any speaker who's gone before could, who feels qualified to respond, could do it. What about methane? There's been no mention of methane all evening that I've heard. And yet, from what I understand, methane is a major contributor to global warming. And that isn't just the fossil fuel industry, that's the agricultural industry, industries. So nothing's been done that much about methane. So wouldn't the government be needed to step in and start to address the methane problem? Thank you.
I'd be happy to answer that, because usually
Please do, Sue. Yep.
methane comes up in the context of cows, but it's not
Yes.
about the cow. The saying is, on the ranching world, it's not the cow, it's the how. It's how the animals are managed. Are they managed in a way that is conscious of this complex biological cycle that recycles the carbon into the soil? So that we actually need more cows. We need more herbivores that are part of maintaining that carbon cycle. And that's a whole different area. And that's part of this reason why I really want to raise some awareness to think about, are we actually defining the problem correctly? We have 10,000 years of history of human impact in a way on a major piece of the earth, the soil ecosystem. And that has been having an exponential impact. And so we're trying to solve the wrong problem. The largest greenhouse gas is actually water vapor, which is why things that we have done that have changed watersheds, that have created heat islands, and there's so many other actions that we have taken. And that's why I say we have to think about any complex system, not complicated. A computer is complicated. You know what's wrong and you fix it. Complex systems with biological components are self-adjusting. You poke it here, something else happens there, and it's not always what you expected. So all the things that we have done interacting with the earth to support our species, all of our agriculture practices.
Your time is up,
Okay.
so just wrap it up.
That's fine. I
Well,
could go on for a long time.
Yeah, thank you so much. Jazz hands, we really appreciate that speech. And I'd now like to turn to Greg Rock. You have 3 minutes, Greg. Could you unmute yourself? And
Yeah.
we look
Hey,
forward to hearing from
everyone.
you.
Great conversation.
I think, when I look at this resolution, I'd like to modify it, of course. I think there's possibly a world, if I just zoom in on the US only, that we could solve this problem without a heavy hand of government, but that world would have to be much different. We would not be spending hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars subsidizing the oil industry. We would not be subsidizing the landfill industry. We would not be subsidizing air travel. We would not be subsidizing trucking. And if we got rid of all those subsidies, and maybe we didn't have, local boards blocking offshore wind, local boards blocking solar utility projects. If all those things were set aside, there was no, blocking of infrastructure that we need for this transition, and we didn't have billions of dollars subsidizing the pollution that we don't want, we would definitely be in a much better place than we are today. So I would take that laissez-faire free market over what we have now. But the reality is we are here today. So we could argue whether we live in a free market or not, but we don't. And there is a tremendous amount of government intervention that is benefiting fossil fuel consumption and production of pollution. And so we need to counteract that. And one thing would be to get rid of some of these subsidies. The other thing would be to enact some policies. And there's 3 levels of policies, as you heard: regulation, subsidies, and market mechanisms. Market mechanisms is my preferred approach. I think it solves a lot of the economic inefficiency problems associated with subsidies and regulations where we're picking and choosing winners. The challenge is we need like a $200 per ton price on carbon to actually solve this problem. And that's politically infeasible in current situations. And Yoram's done fantastic work talking about tax swaps. If we stop taxing income and we stop taxing sales tax and property taxes, we have way more revenue than we could generate with a $200 per ton tax on carbon. So simple tax reform could solve this problem, but that doesn't mean it's going to. And so really where, I'm an engineer, I first started on the technical side of this, then I got into policy. I advocated for policy at the Washington State Legislature for 5 years as a volunteer lobbyist. And I've gone now kind of to the place where we need better leaders. And so my current role is as Executive Director of Clean and Prosperous America, and I'm focused on influencing federal elections. And whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, we can all probably agree that split government gets nothing done. And this is an era where we need action. And so I'm working very hard right now. I think the Senate is in a decent position to maybe be held for the Democrats. We made investments earlier in the cycle. And right now we're laser focused on trying to make critical investments in House congressional races to try to hold the House for the Democrats. My goal is to maintain a trifecta for whoever has the presidency so that we can actually get stuff done. We need to work with both parties. We need to get bipartisan policies through. But at the national landscape, that's not happening. And if you've been in the town, it's toxic. We need to just get power to some people to actually get something done. The Democrats are actually talking positively about getting stuff done. So that's where I land right now.
Yep. You can get your last point out there if you want.
No, that's good.
Thank you so much. Jazz hands. And our first 3-minute speaker. And if there's someone who has a question for Greg, please raise your hand. And just want to make sure we have time for that. We have one question. Joy Olson, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but when I'm listening to all of this, I recognize.
Address the prior speaker.
Oh, I'm sorry. I heard what the speaker was saying, but as I've been listening to this whole thing, because my background is in tax, and worked for a regulated utility, I've no doubt that government has always been involved with energy in a variety of ways. And I hear you saying you think the Democrats are ready to do something, but I look at the reaction the Democratic administration had to the fact that gas prices were going up, and I wonder how we can think they've got any stomach for this, because we have raising gas prices, changing the CAFE standards so we didn't encourage big gas guzzling cars would have been easy peasy things to do. They've been there for 20 years. I go close to it since we've raised the gasoline tax, and the reaction of the administration to gasoline being more expensive was we had to do something quickly to bring it back down. So how much gumption and guts do you think there really is, even if the Democrats are in charge?
Thanks for that question.
Great question. I mean, I'm one of the maybe few people been on this call, but in the US that's like, yes, gas prices are going up. I hope they go higher, because that's what we need is we need a market forcing signal that's going to make people stop burning the stuff. And I've been very disappointed with the Democratic Party, kind of most candidates working hard to lower gas prices, and it's purely political. They need to win elections, and it polls well. And so, you know, I'm no friend to either party in terms of the partisanship and what people do to win elections, and false promises around climate. But I will say that I spent a lot of time talking to legislators on both sides of the aisle, and it's a very different conversation. Most Democrats are a yes vote if it comes up to them, and about 20% of them are true champions trying to design and create actual good policies. When you talk to Republicans, most of them are no votes for anything when it comes up, and maybe 1 or 2% of them are true champions trying to figure out how they can actually do something without getting their head cut off within their party. And so I don't like empty words, but if those words are, I want to do something, I'll take that over the words that say, I don't want to do anything.
Thanks for that answer. Appreciate the speech. Again, jazz hands. Thanks for being here, Greg. We're now going to drop down to 2-minute speeches and try to get in as many people as we can. So I'd like to call on Michael Tilrico. And Michael, if you could unmute, you have 2 minutes to give a speech.
Hello, thank you very much. So I guess since I only have 2 minutes, I'll just be incredibly quick here. I would like to say that I don't think that any of the information that has been said today has been any misinformation or wrong in any way. I think it's nuanced, and I do believe it agrees with each other. I think that I think that we have to take the information that we take about climate change and realize that there are subtle differences in the way that we approach it. Now, the question becomes why am I in the negative for this? Well, I can easily be persuaded to be in the positive for this. The question is will government be willing to do anything that will actually change anything for our local climate? As we know from an earlier speech that the global climate is something very hard to change by the United States, and more or less, the United States may not be able to even affect the global climate on its own, but it certainly can affect its local climate. So I'm in the negative for the government and in the positive for the free market moving this issue and for us using our dollars to basically push this issue with companies is because every time a government entity comes into place, they end up making something worse rather than something better. Hybrid technology right now for cars is a lot more carbon efficient for the globe. Electric cars are much more efficient for local. So the question is what do we want to affect? Do we want to try to affect the global warming, or do we want to try to affect local climate? If we want to affect local climate, absolutely electric cars. If we want to affect global climate, then we need to go to hybrid. And there's lots of other technologies that are incorrect versus our government too, like solar and wind. Why don't we go nuclear? Well, there's a question of, are we trying to affect the local climate or the global climate? And can we affect the global climate by ourselves? So I think that's a question we all need to ask ourselves in terms of where we land on this particular issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Jazz hands. And I know those 2 minutes go by fast, but you have a lot of great thoughts there. Are there any, I'll take one question and raise your hand if you have a question for Michael. I'm going to call on Gary Piazon. Did I get it right that time?
You're closer. I give you
okay, thank
B+.
you. B+.
A-.
Well, I gotta do better.
Regarding the regarding the previous speaker's comments about isn't it a false dichotomy that he has proposed regarding local versus global, and whether or not the US alone can do it, because we're not talking about the US going alone. I'm thinking of the US as a leader. Would
Can
he
you
like
turn
to
that into a
comment
question?
about that choice?
Yeah.
It seems to me a false dichotomy to say, well, we can either lead or not lead. We can, if he doesn't even mention the option of leading. He just proposes that we're either going to go alone or not. And if we are the strongest economy in the world, if we lead, others will follow.
Thank you. Thank you for the, so the question could be, does the prior speaker believe that the US can lead? And would that effectively address an outsized role in climate change?
As I said before, I can very easily be convinced to be in the affirmative of this action. The only question is can we lead in the right direction? Do we go with our current technology of battery technology, for example? The carbon output for an electric vehicle does not match a hybrid until 170,000 miles is driven on both cars. But by 150,000 miles, normal electric cars need their batteries replaced, which means that a hybrid vehicle will always produce less emissions over the life of that car than an electric vehicle. So why are we pushing electric vehicles? That doesn't make sense to me. So there are, and as for wind and solar, there are similar calculations that can be done against nuclear, but we're not going nuclear. We want to go solar and wind. So if we pushed the correct things, I would absolutely agree. Let's be the leader in the world. But I believe that we are pushing the incorrect things. So no, we should not be leading us down the wrong path, which has been mentioned by quite a few in the negative and affirmative on both sides of this speech in this debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Jazz Hands. And I want to go to our next speaker in the affirmative, Sandy Weston. Could you please unmute yourself? And you have 2 minutes.
Good evening, and I want to bring up something from an entirely different tangent. I'm going to go for the devil's advocacy position. This is now 2023. We are looking around our country in just the past year or two and seeing we had temperatures of 114 here this summer in the Tri-Cities. We have forest fires raging across the West, especially. If you look at a map of the forest fires during the summer, you can hardly see any land. There are little fire emblems practically everywhere. We're now seeing hurricanes getting very much damaging, even more so than before. And by the way, there was even a typhoon in Alaska and British Columbia. Okay, that's all by saying this is a time of climate change. We can't say we've got to get ready for it. We are in it. And I'm for one to say we're already past the tipping point and we're not admitting it. We are looking at, to what do we call it, cap and trade programs to decide who's to blame and who can get past some guilt. Irrelevant. What I'm looking at is, okay, what's happening in Florida today is a dress rehearsal for the immigration we're going to see when the ocean levels come up and there is no more property value in southern Florida. Those people have to move not just for a few days, but for the rest of their lives. Where are they going to go? What's that going to do to the southern United States economy? Texas. What's it going to do to our economy up here in Washington? That's where I think government needs to lead. And I think that needs to be at the state level, because at the federal level, you can't get your arms around something that is as disparate as Arizona and Minneapolis and Florida and Washington. They have different needs. I think that needs to be a state decision and leadership process. And I believe the federal government's role is within our country to coordinate and build collaborative relationships among the state's needs, as well as research, and then to also represent ourselves positively and effectively in the world community to look at the larger problem.
Thank you very much for that speech. And we'll take one question. I'd like to call on Kobe de Lespinas, and you can unmute yourself.
Yes, I wondered whether the speaker could recommend reading material about the seriousness of the situation.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, I do not have that kind of reference, but I'm
Yeah.
sure there is plenty out there.
Yeah, there's-
I just will not claim to know.
Thank you. Yeah, and you know what? One thing I would say is we're going to send an email out after this debate, and if people have any comments, including resources that they think others might be interested in, please send them to us, and we'll try to share that out with everybody. Okay, the next speaker, also a 2-minute speech in the negative, would be Robert Burton. Robert, you have 2 minutes. Please unmute yourself. Robert, are you with us? I don't. Does anybody see Robert? Okay, I'm gonna then go to Ken Whalen. Ken, can you please unmute yourself? And you.
Thank you. A lot of good comments in the session. My comments are going to be very different. I'm going to make everybody mad.
Well, please do it respectfully and civilly, sir.
Oh, it's just going to be questions. For decades, I've had a series of topics about the so-called global warming phenomenon, to which I have not gotten any answers. First of all, the polar bear was supposed to be going extinct around the year 2000. They're flourishing. What happened? The Arctic ice pack was supposed to be gone by the year 2005, or was it 1999? Still there. The oceans are supposed to be rising. I don't see it in Seattle. My brother doesn't see it in Deerfield Beach, Florida. We're supposed to be getting more and stronger hurricanes. I've not seen them in the past 30 years. You look at the Category 5 hurricanes, haven't increased. Now Prince Charles, now King Charles, was saying for a while, we have 36 months to the end of the world, 30 months, 24 months. That was back in 2000. Like I said, questions I've not gotten answers to. The term global warming suddenly became climate change. What happened? I have a whole series of more questions like that. I just want to throw, they're just questions. I'm not taking sides. I think the premise is realistic, but not really good. Just asking questions, and I don't get answers to my questions. For example, does anybody know where in Seattle that Puget Sound, the sea level of Puget Sound is being recorded? And has it changed in the past 30 years? I don't think so. I don't see Puget Sound rising at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those thought-provoking questions, which we will leave as rhetorical in people's minds. And I think the gist of it is that there are a lot of questions about this topic that certainly you and others would like to have answered. So I really appreciate that. We have time for just one more speech. We're getting to the end of the 2 hours. It's going by very quickly. I wish everybody who wanted to speak would have the opportunity to. So I apologize to those who won't, but I'd like to give the last word to Bernard Seeger. Bernard, you have 2 minutes. If you could unmute yourself and give your speech.
Yeah, hi, thanks everybody. So I enjoyed this forum, and I sympathize with folks who want the market to solve this problem. I grew up in Texas, very conservative area, and that's kind of the culture that I grew up in. Now I live in Oregon, and I've read a lot about this challenge and have come to the firm conclusion, unfortunately, market forces won't solve this without the government stepping in. Now, having said that, I do support what many folks have been discussing, and that's a carbon tax, which drives the market to price this externality and lead to, you know, lower carbon emissions across all industries. That's included with the carbon border adjustment. So there's a huge incentive on our global trading partners to do the exact same thing. If we do that, we can turn this boat around. Now, the example I wanted to give quickly was the Cuyahoga River fire from 1968 that many people may remember or maybe have read about. And I did some more reading, and it was a fascinating historical tale. So many people don't know, but that river caught fire 100 years later. The first time it caught fire was in 1868. And what did the market do in the next 100 years? Zero. They actually made it worse. So I'd like to think if the private market is going to step up to burning rivers running through incredible towns, what makes us think that it's going to step up to climate? And it wasn't till, to close the loop on that, it was after that and a series of other environmental disasters that led us to the EPA, the Clean Water Act of 1970, and a whole host of other changes in which the government stepped in to protect those commons. We heard about tragedy of commons. That is indeed why you have to have government involvement, because without it, private markets will just abuse the commons and lead to, you know, the challenges where we all lose.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you to Bernard. Thank you to all of our speakers tonight. We are out of time, I'm sorry to say. I'd like, we have about 10 more minutes, and I hope everybody will stick around with us. But I'd like a motion to end the debate. If somebody could just unmute and make a motion to.
I so move.
Thank you. So moved. And the debate is now formally ended. The first thing I wanted to do is get, you know, we've had this experience tonight of talking about a tough topic, and one on which people can really disagree, and on which people can be very combative. And I hope that this experience was a little bit different. And so I just wanted to open up the floor. I wanted to open up the chat window, and I wanted to ask people to raise their hands, and I could call on you. But I'd love for people to reflect on what surprised you, and what did you learn about this conversation? If you just have any thoughts on what surprised you and what did you learn, real quick popcorn answers to those questions. Put them in the chat window, or I'll call on people as well. What surprised you? What did you learn? I'm going to start by calling on Firduz Oneza. Please unmute yourself and just let us know quickly.
Thank you. I think that we're in such an emergency in terms of climate change that there is no question when we're in danger, that there's no question we need to jump in with every tools that we have. So climate change is a very comprehensive topic. We need to address not just energy or vehicle, whether electric or hybrid, but we also need to have our living style, our regulations, community design, all of those. And I'm a planner myself. So I think that comprehensive thought is important. And I don't think that, I mean, we don't design cities without regulations or government policies. So I don't think that this is a topic that would be even a question that whether government intervention is needed or not. I think that we need to have all the tools to address this.
Thank you so much. Again, what surprised you, or what did you learn? Michael, Marthal, or Oroville?
Yes, thank you. This part of the conversation is the internet issue. The question that comes through my mind, what I learned, a lot of very intelligent, thoughtful, articulate people, but I only actually heard one person discussing how this really affects humanity as a whole, and how we as a whole can actually picture a future and what we're looking for. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Alan Falk, what surprised you, or what did you learn?
I'll mute myself first.
Yep.
As I wrote in chat, it didn't surprise me at all to hear that most people can't and won't change their minds on the subject and don't entertain or accept opposing information. And as Phil just put into the chat, surprised that people debated climate change is happening rather than government doing something about it. Well, I have sent to my whip a website link to a personal page of mine where if anyone wants to hear a rebuttal, I've been collecting them for the better part of a decade. So they really exist. And I'm looking forward to sharing them because there is a lot of doubt about it that people don't acknowledge. And the other point is,
Okay, wait, make it quick. We're trying to go quick here.
yes, I'll make it as quick as I can. For people who want government to do things for us, name a whole bunch of government agencies that have met their goals. Department of Energy? Nope. We were exporting energy last year, 2 years ago. Now we're not. And a few other agencies like that. They failed. They failed to meet their charters.
All right, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Surprised? What surprised you? What did you learn? I'm going to call on Carol Swiggett.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna butt in here.
Make it quick. Oh, you're muted.
Unmute, Carol, and then slap them.
Unmute, there you go. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. What I learned is that there are a lot of people who feel this is an existential threat. The problem we have is that the word implies hurry up. The problem we have is that what needs to be done does not match a hurry up solution. And the data that is used to support existential does not stand up. And if we choose solutions that don't take into account entropy, we will find ourselves searching for the wrong energy answers, which are the answers that need to be made correctly.
Okay, thank you. For anybody who's wondering, that was my dad from Arizona. Thanks for jumping in, Dad. I appreciate it. Appreciate what you had to share. And we'll do one more, surprised or learned. Why don't we go to Sharon Lonergan? Sharon, take us home.
I'm surprised that there's still ideas, information, theories, explanations out there that I'm unaware of and that I would love to hear more about. And I guess I'm a little disappointed because I still feel like I understand that people have really strong emotions on this, and I really do appreciate that and respect that. But if you're going to name call or impugn motives, then I can't listen. Like, it just shuts me down. I really wish we had a space, even though people feel really strongly about this, where we could really unpack some of these different ideas, because I think that issue is a lot more complex and complicated than we hear about most of the time. So I would love to learn more. And given all the spaces that are available, I think Braver Angels has done the best job. So good job.
Thank you. Thank you so much. What a great segue to our, I wanted to ask Joe Pratt, are you still with us, Joe? Because we oftentimes at the end of these events will ask someone who's been with Braver Angels to talk about why they're involved and what it means to them. And if you're still here, Joe, I'd love for you to take a minute or two and talk about Braver Angels.
Sure, I'm still here. So Braver Angels is for people who are frustrated about the current state of our politics and who are curious about ways to solve the problem. I got involved. I was invited to attend a workshop about 3 years ago when I was official in the King County Republican Party. I found the experience exhilarating and challenging. And it was called a red-blue workshop, and I'm in a red-blue marriage. My wife and I have canceled out each other's votes for 31 years now, on 95% of the time. oddly enough, when we met in the late 80s, like it would never have would have occurred to me that because of our political differences, we should not fall in love and get married. But recently, my wife's conservative stepfather told her he would never marry a person like her. So how things have changed in the last 30 years. I have met many great friends. I've learned new perspectives on many issues since I've been in Braver Angels. So I encourage you to stick around if you're new to us. And if you look at the chat, there's two things there. There's a link to fill out a survey about tonight's event. There's also a link to become a member of Braver Angels. And to become a member requires only payment of $1 a month or $12 a year. If you're not quite ready to take the plunge as a member, you can go to the website and just sign up to the email subscription list. And you'll get emails on Wednesdays and Sundays about the various happenings in Braver Angels. And maybe that'll convince you to join if tonight hasn't. So back to you, Cliff.
Thanks a lot, Joe. Appreciate that. And really, I just want to say this, for me, this was a great night. This is an issue that I care quite a bit about. And I am so blown away at collectively how smart we are and how empathetic we are and how we see so much of what needs to be seen in order to make good decisions about what we should do in the future. I wish we had more conversations like this all the time. And so I value so much everybody's contribution, and there'll be a recording of this. I look forward to hearing your thoughts ongoing, and I hope we can do it again. So that's it. Good night. Thanks, everybody. Have a great evening. Take care.
Thanks very much.
Good night.
Good job, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night. Thanks so much.